Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. It's time, once again, for another depressing dose of dismal Disney. This is the third and final part of a video series that I began last week, going through a very lengthy exposé that was published in the New York Times on Sunday, September 8th, 2024, entitled The Palace Coup at the Magic Kingdom, with the subtitle, The Inside Story of How Bob Iger Undermined and Outmaneuvered Bob Chapek, His Chosen Successor and Return to Power at Disney. But before proceeding, I'd like to ask everyone to please like this video, please leave a comment, please subscribe to support this channel, and please press the bell to receive notifications. Thanks! In part 1 of this video series, I described Bob Iger as a master manipulator, which he truly is. He had set up Disney's board of directors to be nothing more than a rubber stamp so that he could essentially do whatever he wanted, to include making Bob Chapek CEO in early 2020 without giving the board an opportunity to vet him and to know whether he was actually qualified for the job. But I don't believe that Iger actually cared whether Chapek was qualified to be CEO. Instead, I believe that Iger had convinced himself that Chapek would simply do whatever he wanted, and Chapek had initially made the serious mistake of blindly trusting Iger. But as I had explained in part 2, Chapek's trust in Iger was destroyed when an interview that Iger had given to New York Times columnist Ben Smith was published in an article on April 12, 2020 that said, quote, after a few weeks of letting Chapek take charge, Iger smoothly reasserted control, unquote. It then referred to Chapek as the quote-unquote new nominal chief executive and speculated that the choice of Iger's successor, quote-unquote, may be open again. So initially, not having made Chapek a member of the board of directors when he became CEO in February of 2020, which was a very unusual business practice, the board turned around and did exactly that on April 15th, which was 3 days after Ben Smith's column was published. And the board's relationship with Iger was also damaged, even though in Iger's egotistical mind, he had done nothing wrong. But Chapek had also become convinced that Iger was out to get rid of him and return as CEO. Naturally, there were a lot of red flags that I identified in parts 1 and 2, a total of 13, which I won't reiterate here for the sake of brevity. Instead, I'll resume the exposé discussion with its 8th subsection that's entitled, This is His Company to Run. Paraphrasing, as the coup continued well into the fall of 2020, Disney's theme parks were heavily impacted, movie theaters were closed, and all new movie and television production had come to a halt. And since people were staying home, many were subscribing to streaming services like Disney+, but as new content dried up, subscriber growth slowed just as Disney+ had become one of Disney's few active revenue sources. So to increase subscriber growth, Chapek wanted new content from his studio heads, such as Pete Docter of Pixar, Kevin Feige of Marvel, and Jennifer Lee of Disney Animation, to put on Disney+, but they wanted to withhold their best content for theatrical releases. But Chapek didn't know when movie theaters might reopen, and he needed more streaming revenue to help cover the massive debt payments that Disney had to pay from Iger's 2017 purchase of 20th Century Fox. So Chapek, unable to compel his studio heads to be cooperative in the midst of a crisis, instead proposed remaking the company around a new division, Disney Media and Entertainment Distribution, to give priority to streaming services such as Disney+, Hulu, and ESPN+, and to guarantee that they received a steady flow of Disney's best content. DMED, as it became known, would now have bottom-line responsibility for all of the company's entertainment and would decide where films and programs would appear, in theaters, on television, or, as was increasingly likely, on Disney+. It would also be Chapek's signature initiative as chief executive. So even though this seemingly made complete business sense, there were also some serious flaws. It would strip Disney's creative heads of authority over spending, as well as where their movies and shows would be distributed, which would be a huge loss of power and status. Moreover, Hollywood talent wanted guarantees of where projects would end up before committing to a deal. And that was totally understandable given that their earnings are tied directly to where a production is distributed. Although the division heads would still report to Chapek and indirectly to Iger, it was still a huge demotion. In many ways, their new boss would really be the head of DMED. Initially, Chapek wanted Alan Bergman, who was then the chairman of Walt Disney Studios and a figure both well-known in Hollywood and respected by Disney's creative teams, to lead DMED, but after talking with Iger, he turned down the offer. So Chapek then turned to 13-year Disney veteran Kareem Daniel to head DMED, but he was barely known outside of the company and had little experience with movies or television. Overnight, Daniel would be running a division with more than $50 billion in annual revenue and would be in the spotlight as Disney's highest-ranking black executive. But like Bergman, Daniel had his doubts about the wisdom of the proposed restructuring. Chapek also spent hours talking with Iger about his idea, but while Iger was unenthusiastic, he didn't actually object. So in early October of 2020, after Chapek thought he'd gotten Iger's blessing on the idea, Bergman called Chapek and told him, quote, "Iger just told me we're not doing the reorganization," unquote, and that Iger hated the idea. And when Chapek called Iger, Iger admitted telling Bergman that he hated the idea, but wouldn't say why he didn't want to tell Chapek. A more seasoned chief executive might well have paused at this juncture, given the lack of internal support. At least a dozen senior Disney executives had told Chapek that the reorganization was a bad idea. But the Disney board gave Chapek its strong backing for the creation of Disney Media and Entertainment Distribution after extended discussions in which Iger raised questions but said nothing to oppose it. Iger was on such thin ice with the board at that time that there was little he could say without appearing to undermine Chapek. "This is his company to run," Iger said to the directors at one point. So the reorganization and Daniel's promotion were announced on October 12, 2020. For Chapek, he thought he had finally accomplished something and he was proud of it. He later told a reporter at the Times, quote, "It was singularly the best thing I could have done to transform this culture," unquote. But I'm going to flag this as Chapek's first big mistake as CEO, the establishment of DMED. Iger had started this ball rolling when he manipulated Chapek and the board into making Chapek CEO because he believed that he could control Chapek and the board. But his interview with the New York Times, published 6 months earlier, in which he publicly humiliated Chapek, was the moment that he lost control thanks to his own unbridled egotism. But the reality of DMED emerged in July of 2021 when Scarlett Johansson's movie Black Widow opened both in theaters and on Disney+, which effectively reduced Johansson's earnings by as much as $50 million, all thanks to Chapek's DMED. And this is what Bergman had warned might happen as a result of DMED. So Johansson sued Disney, but in response, in a letter that Chapek had signed off on, Iger accused Johansson of quote-unquote callous disregard for the adverse impact that the coup had on theatergoers. But when an article appeared in The Hollywood Reporter about the lawsuit, Chapek was stunned when he was being blamed and not Iger. As CEO, of course Chapek was going to be blamed. Skipping the subsection entitled Fasten Your Seatbelts, which talks about Iger's retirement party at Disney in November of 2021, we'll briefly move on to the subsection entitled It's Going to Get Worse. On November 30th, 2021, Iger presided over his last board meeting, but instead of talking about his accomplishments, he criticized Chapek, asserting that under Chapek, the collegial culture that Iger had built over 15 years was crumbling. Disney was a company that depended first and foremost on creativity, and Chapek's DMED reorganization had damaged Disney's creative engines. The company, he said, had become distracted by a deep rift. Chapek and his allies on one side, Disney's creative executives and the Hollywood talent community on the other. Iger didn't ask for Chapek to be fired or for himself to continue as chair, but Chapek believed that things were going to get worse, and he started to refer to Iger as an assassin. And things did quickly become a lot worse, as described in the subsection entitled A Mea Culpa. And this is where the exposé gets into the LGBTQ issues and Chapek's flip-flopping on them. During Iger's tenure, the studio had greenlit a bevy of projects with progressive social and political themes, but Chapek worried the development slate had veered too far left on social issues. And he was right. Disney had veered too far to the left. Disney was being pulled into partisan political debates more frequently, which was a worrisome situation for a brand that was supposed to stand for everyone, and some board members agreed. Coming up through the pipeline was Strange World, Disney's first animated film focusing on an openly gay teenager, which was ultimately released on November 23, 2022, and was a huge flop for that year. Board member Safra Katz was so opposed to the character that she told Chapek that she'd have him fired if Disney released the film. Naturally, he reported the threat to Susan Arnold, but by that point, the film was too far along for Chapek to block it, and his fears about Disney becoming a cultural flashpoint soon materialized. And Chapek didn't handle the situation well at all. In January 2022, the Parental Rights in Education Bill was introduced in Florida. The prominent LGBTQ advocacy organization Human Rights Campaign had obtained more than 100 corporate signatories to a letter opposing anti-gay legislation in various state houses. Media companies like Comcast, which owns NBC Universal, had signed on, but Disney, one of the largest employers in Florida, was conspicuously absent. Chapek realized that staying silent might cause controversy, so he called Susan Arnold, who had succeeded Iger as chairman, to discuss his view that Disney had become too politicized, and mentioned the Florida bill and the pressure on Disney to publicly condemn it. Arnold agreed that Disney should stay above the fray, but she said the company should sign the Human Rights Campaign letter since so many other companies had already signed, including Nike, General Motors, and Oracle, whose chief executive sat on Disney's board, and Chapek agreed. And if that's what Chapek had done and left it at that, then I doubt Florida would have gone after Disney, but that's not what happened. On February 1st, at the board's first meeting with Iger no longer at the company, Jeff Morrill, the new chief corporate affairs officer, gave a presentation arguing that Disney should stay out of divisive social and political issues, especially at the state and local levels, unless necessary. Disney should fight, quote, "the wars, not the battles," unquote, he said. He also said Disney's employees, who were accustomed to Iger making public comments supporting progressive positions, would need to be reconditioned, and the board agreed. Then on February 8th, President Biden issued a statement on Twitter expressing support for the LGBTQ community, while Disney remained silent and soon faced an internal revolt. Creative employees, many of whom are gay or staunchly supportive of gay colleagues and friends, were still seething over the DMED reorganization, and now this. Iger then retweeted Biden's post on February 24th, and he included a statement opposing Florida's bill. Only days later, a Disney LGBTQ employee group sent a letter to Chapek and other high-ranking executives demanding that Disney oppose the bill and denounce similar legislation pending in other states. Chapek met with the group the following week, and the board also held an emergency meeting to discuss the matter, with Chapek explaining that in keeping with Disney's new policy, that the company had not signed the Human Rights Campaign letter. This made Susan Arnold very angry since Chapek hadn't told her that they had decided to not sign it after telling her that they would. And upsetting Susan Arnold was one of the worst things that Chapek could have done since she had been one of his staunchest supporters on the board. But despite the pressure from employees, Disney's board agreed to stay the course. Chapek and his corporate affairs team drafted a statement defending Disney's decision not to comment, which was circulated to Susan Arnold and the rest of the board. Quote, "Corporate statements do very little to change outcomes or minds. Instead, they are often weaponized by one side or the other to further divide and inflame," unquote. And while that was a very logical thing to say, when the memo was sent out to Disney employees on March 7th, it totally backfired. And then, letters and calls from prominent people criticizing Disney's failure to speak out poured into Chapek, to include Abigail Disney, granddaughter of the co-founder Roy O. Disney, who tweeted about it on social media, and the Los Angeles Times called it quote-unquote corporate cowardice. This is when Chapek, rather than stand his ground, bowed to the growing pressure and flip-flopped. Susan Arnold then advised Chapek to reverse course and condemn the bill, saying that he was losing the creative community and that he had to stand with his team. So on March 9th, which was Arnold's first shareholder meeting as chair, Chapek extolled the company's recent accomplishments in a taped video and then delivered a mea culpa. Quote, "I understand our political approach, no matter how well-intentioned, didn't quite get the job done," unquote, he said. He announced that Disney would sign the letter and give $5 million to the organization. The Human Rights Campaign promptly said it would take the money, but only after Disney demonstrated that it was following through on its promises. And here's where Chapek went too far. 2 days later, Chapek went even further in another memo to employees, quote, "You needed me to be a stronger ally in the fight for equal rights, and I let you down. I am sorry," unquote. And taking direct aim at Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, he also halted political contributions in the state. At this point, Susan Arnold and others at Disney thought Chapek had gone too far, and it gave Ron DeSantis a national platform to mock the company, which then led to Florida revoking Disney's special tax status, resulting in it losing its Reedy Creek Improvement District. So I'll flag this as Chapek's second big mistake as CEO, bowing to pressure to speak against Florida's parental rights in education law and going too far. But Chapek thought it was unfair that he was being blamed for a policy that had been endorsed by the board at every step. And of course, Iger didn't remain silent. He appeared on CNN on March 31st saying, quote, "To me, it wasn't about politics. It's about what is right and what is wrong, and that just seemed wrong," unquote. In response, Chapek asked the board to renew his contract as CEO as a show of support, but Susan Arnold didn't want to go public with it at that moment, and she wanted to buy time to give the board an opportunity to discuss whether he was fit to be CEO. So doubts about Chapek's leadership abilities had persisted the entire time, and his actions only made matters worse. Then, in the subsection entitled Unnerving Calls, Chapek learned about Iger trash-talking him, but since he had retired, the board no longer had leverage over Iger. And since the board had no alternative to Chapek, on June 28th, the board announced that, quote, "Chapek is the right leader at the right time for the Walt Disney Company, and the board has full confidence in him and his leadership team," unquote. Obviously, that was a total lie, and there's no indication given in the exposé that Chapek was aware of the board's ongoing doubts about his qualifications, at least not until the very end when it was too late. And that brings us to the subsection entitled, We Have to Save Chapek, and it will become clear very soon who the we was. Since becoming chief executive in 2020, Chapek's sometimes rocky tenure had been buoyed by Disney's strong share price. But since hitting a record high in March 2021, it had been falling, along with stocks of other entertainment companies grappling with the new economics of streaming and the decline of cable. As an example, in April 2022, Netflix reported it had lost subscribers for the first time in 10 years, panicking Wall Street, and its shares lost 35% in just one day. And seemingly overnight, investors went from caring only about subscriber numbers to focusing on earnings and losses. In other words, the streaming honeymoon was over. And by the time the board announced Chapek's new contract, Disney shares had dropped almost 50% from their peak, So low, in fact, that activist investors like Dan Loeb and Nelson Peltz were circling the company, seeking board seats and calling for management changes. And Peltz knew a good deal about Disney and Iger thanks to his neighbor in Palm Beach, Ike Perlmutter, who had sold Marvel to Disney in 2009 and stayed on as Marvel's chairman. The deal had made the irascible Perlmutter one of Disney's largest shareholders, who had also frequently clashed with Iger over the years. In 2015, Perlmutter tried to fire Kevin Feige, Marvel's celebrated movie chief, amid a disagreement about budgets, but Iger saved Feige and then demoted Perlmutter by stripping superhero movies from his oversight. Then in 2019, Iger further marginalized Perlmutter by taking away the television portion of his job and leaving him with only a tiny fiefdom involving comics publishing and a few consumer products. Perlmutter had been glad to see Iger step down, but Perlmutter had sources within the company who had convinced him that Iger was plotting a return, and Perlmutter warned Chapek, which only fanned Chapek's own anxieties about Iger's intentions. And this is where we'll see Chapek's third biggest mistake as CEO unfold. Thanks to Perlmutter's encouragement, Chapek met with Peltz in July at Disneyland Paris, and the two men forged a rapport. Soon after, Perlmutter called several board members, including Safra Catz, lobbying them to add Peltz to the board. If not, he warned, Iger would be back at Disney. Then, in a call to Horacio Gutierrez, the company's new general counsel, Perlmutter told him, "We have to save Chapek. We can't allow Iger to come back." So Chapek told Susan Arnold that he thought inviting Peltz made sense because it would spare Disney a costly and distracting proxy fight. But Arnold said the board would never offer Peltz a seat, partially because of his friendship with Perlmutter. The board was wary of Perlmutter given the antagonism between him and Iger, and also because of Perlmutter's campaign against Feige, whom the board had come to view as a crucial employee. And you might think that that would have been enough to let Chapek know that he should stop talking with the two men, but he continued due to his own anxieties and mistrust of Iger, thus making it what I believe was his third biggest mistake as CEO. And not long thereafter came what I believe was Chapek's fourth biggest mistake as CEO, as described in this next subsection entitled, I Am Telling the Truth. Chapek did something completely foolish. In late October or early November, he failed to read an earnings report created by Christine McCarthy, who was then Disney's CFO, in which she reported that Disney's earnings per share would be 27 cents below Wall Street estimates, which was far more than what she and Chapek previously discussed, and a result sure to shock Wall Street. Disney's streaming business was still signing up subscribers at a fast pace, but soaring programming and marketing costs meant that streaming was now heading toward a $1.5 billion quarterly loss, which was up from $630 million a year earlier, and just when investors had been promised that there would be a light at the end of the tunnel. Chapek then felt blindsided because, not having read about the earnings loss himself, he had mistakenly believed that her presentation to the board would focus on the strong Disney Plus subscriber growth. Then, after trying to get her to wrap up her presentation, he confronted her privately immediately thereafter, which she later described as being attacked for being truthful. Board member Safra Catz then asked McCarthy whether Chapek was up to doing the job, and McCarthy answered, "He can't do it." Then an angry Susan Arnold called Chapek and demanded, "How could you attack Christine?" Chapek said, "She had never told me the numbers." But that wasn't true. He hadn't bothered to read her package before the meeting. Then, in the next subsection entitled Petting a Hippo, Horacio Gutierrez, Disney's general counsel, had scheduled a series of meetings in Orlando, saying he wanted to ensure a common understanding of the situation and plan for what would surely be a difficult earnings call. But instead of attending, Chapek petted a hippo at Disney World to appear more personable, as had been suggested to him by the board. Communications chief Christina Shake had also tried to warn Chapek that the quarterly results would prompt a cascade of negative news articles, but he brushed her off. So when Chapek unveiled the less than stellar earnings on November 8th, he reported that the earnings fell short of estimates by 26 cents per share, but did not mention the $1.5 billion in streaming losses. Nonetheless, Disney stock dropped 13% over the next 24 hours. With the stock seemingly in freefall, creative personnel revolting, and Chapek no longer on speaking terms with Chief Financial Officer Christine McCarthy, Gutierrez called Susan Arnold. Chapek didn't have the credibility or leadership skills to continue as CEO, Gutierrez told her. He also told her that the only person who could solve the problems was Bob Iger. "You aren't the first to suggest that," she replied. In the next to last subsection entitled Alarm Bells, with Chapek once again visiting Peltz and Perlmutter, Susan Arnold ordered him in a private call to have no further contact with Peltz, and the next day she called Iger. And during the 15-minute conversation, after apologizing to Iger for the rupture in their relationship, she asked him if he'd come back. He agreed on several conditions, to include announcing it immediately. The next day, as Chapek was preparing to attend an Elton John concert, Susan Arnold called him and told him that he was out. And that was it. In the final subsection entitled Iger's Last Extension, Iger, as CEO once again, immediately dismantled Chapek's DMED, he ousted Ike Perlmutter, and he eventually forced Christine McCarthy to resign. Susan Arnold left the board on her own in March of 2023, and Safra Catz left this past July. So Chapek's worst fear that Iger would return was realized, but his own mistakes contributed directly to Iger's ultimate return. Had Chapek avoided Perlmutter and Peltz and not upset Christine McCarthy, then the events that transpired in his final weeks that contributed significantly to his own downfall would not have occurred. While Chapek's DMED may have had some short-term gains, in the long term it wasn't sustainable, and his sole reason for creating it was due to his own inability to get the creatives within Disney to help support Disney Plus during a crisis. He refused to listen about the negatives that would occur as a result of DMED, and he created new long-term problems for Disney in how he overreacted to the LGBTQ issues and Florida. As manipulative as Iger is, Chapek would probably have been better off had he attempted to maintain a positive relationship with the man instead of allowing a feud to erupt between them, because as the saying goes, it takes two to argue. Iger was incredibly foolish too in believing too much in the power of his own ego and overestimating his ability to control the entire narrative when there were simply too many variables involved. But after hurting numerous people and Disney's reputation, Iger ultimately got what he wanted, and having recently had his contract renewed through to 2026, he appears to be in no hurry to find yet another replacement to become Disney's next CEO. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.